Johnson will not be short of advice when he moves into number 10 the day after tomorrow, as everyone expects him to do. There's probably never been a Prime Minister who needs it more. In just over 3 months, we shall be facing perhaps the biggest challenge this country's ever faced in peacetime. We'll be leaving the European Union and, barring a miracle, leaving without a deal. And that, according to one of Mr Johnson's predecessors in number 10, is a gargantuan risk. He is Tony Blair. He's written about it in the Times this morning, and he's with me. Good morning to you.
Good morning, John.
Gargantuan, big word.
Yeah, it's a big risk.
Because?
Because you're crashing out of the European Union without any agreed arrangements as to your future trading. If you add in the customs union alongside the single market, well over half our trade is governed by European arrangements. To come out of those with no deal, with no agreed way forward, that is, of course, is a huge risk. I mean, no one could possibly say it's not a risk. No developed country has ever done it before. If you speak to anybody who's familiar with World Trade Organization rules, they'll tell you they simply can't predict exactly how difficult it's going to be. But for sure, it's very difficult. Whether it's catastrophic or not, we hopefully we will not find out by experience. But yeah, I think if you talk to anybody reasonably objective, they would say it's an enormous risk. If you try and measure that risk, obviously you will get different views.
And if you look at what Boris Johnson has written in the Telegraph this morning, it needs a wee bit of chutzpah, it needs a wee bit of looking at history and telling us we've overcome enormous odds in the past. You've just got to have a wee bit of faith, really.
Yeah, it's a very Boris Johnson approach to things, which is to say, look, never mind the detail, but if we only believe in ourselves, we can do it. And I found the article this morning. I mean, it's one of these things where, essentially what he was saying was, look, the Americans put a man on the moon, and therefore surely we can find a way around the Irish border problem. To which the obvious response of the Europeans will be, well, if it's that simple, why are you opposed to the backstop? But in any event, the two things are obviously rather technically different.
But your solution is a referendum, and that is simply not going to happen. Boris Johnson has repeatedly argued against a second referendum.
Yeah, he has repeatedly argued against it, but he's arguing at the moment that he will be able to secure a deal with Europe on the basis that they will delete the Irish backstop, put all of the arrangements over Ireland into the future trading relationship between Britain and the EU. And that's something I think just isn't going to happen. From all the conversations I've had in Europe, I think there's no prospect whatever of Europe reneging on its commitment to the Irish and giving to Boris Johnson something that for 3 years they've refused to give to Theresa May. So in those circumstances, he's going to be heading towards no deal. Parliament is obviously deeply opposed to no deal. So you're going to have a situation where he either tries to circumvent the will of Parliament and take this risk without any form of public endorsement, either an election or a referendum. And I just can't see him doing that. So you're right, at the moment he's set his face against a referendum. But if we're faced with the choice between a no-deal Brexit and going back to the people, then the case for a referendum is extraordinarily strong.
Except that you missed out the principal argument that he gives for opposing a referendum, which is, and I'm quoting him, that it would be nothing less than a flagrant breach of promise to the people of this entire country. And that is true, isn't it? They were told, if you vote for leaving the European Union, that is what will happen. No ifs, no ands, no buts.
Yes, but here's 2 points that we've got to put on the other side of the scales in that. The first is that, yes, it's true. We were told if we voted to leave the European Union, we would leave. But we were never told we were going to leave without any agreement with the EU, with no deal. That is something, indeed, people at the time consistently said would not happen because a deal was going to be easy. The Europeans would be queuing up in order to agree these future trading arrangements. So I don't believe you can say that June 2016 is a mandate for no deal. But
that is what the Prime Minister at the time said.
Yeah, but you just go back and you see what was actually said at the time.
You can't do that in politics, can you? You can't go back and say, if Hitler hadn't done this in 1939, we wouldn't have been... you can't do that.
But you can do this. You can go back and say, do you really think that the one-off vote in June 2016 is a mandate for no deal? And I would say that it isn't. And furthermore, I would say that 3 years and more on from that vote, we've got a wealth more information at our fingertips. And is it really undemocratic to go back to people and say, in the light of all this mess and with a decision of this magnitude, we're asking you, do you want to tell us again, or do you want to think again?
Well, actually, you wouldn't be asking them, would you? You'd be telling them. If you call a referendum, they have to vote. So you're actually telling them that they have to vote, and they will tell you that they've already voted. Let me quote you what your own former speechwriter, Phil Collins, said. We must go through with Brexit because otherwise populists like Farage will have an historic grievance that could fester. If Britain does not leave the EU, then Nigel Farage will be a fixture in British politics. And that's true, isn't it?
I'm not sure it is true. By the way, I have a huge respect for Phil, but I don't agree with them on this particular point because in the end, it's a question of look, Brexit is divisive, and I agree whatever you do now is going to be extremely difficult. But just imagine if we tumble out of Europe without a deal, with no further endorsement from the British people, against the wishes of Parliament. I mean, don't you think there's going to be a huge reaction on the other side? So I don't think we can allow Nigel Farage to determine the future of this country. You know, if we offend him, then somehow we mustn't do this. I think the argument for having another referendum in circumstances where we're otherwise going to go out of the European Union without a deal, I think the argument is overwhelming. I don't. But the reality, I can't possibly see how it's undemocratic to ask people, look, in the light of all that's happened, do you want to think again?
Well, it's straightforward, isn't it? You ask people to vote in a referendum, you tell them that their vote will be decisive, and then you say, well, actually, we've had another look at it, and it's not looking terribly good, so try again. And next time, those 17 million odd people who voted to leave, if they do it again, but it isn't quite enough, and they lose this time, it is absolutely inevitable as night follows day that they will say, we want to do it again now.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true, by the way. I think there is a huge desire in this country to settle this issue once and for all. It's just that I think, you can go around this argument, frankly, for forever. But I think there is a deep recognition that this thing has turned out to be a massive distraction, far more difficult than we thought. And I really don't think it's unreasonable to say to people, given the hugeness of this decision, especially when we're going to be doing the hardest form of Brexit. I mean, the one type of Brexit that, as it were, at the beginning of this, people would have said, well, that's not going to happen. We're surely going to have an agreement with Europe. In these circumstances, it's really undemocratic to say to people, before we do something that is so huge in its implications for our country, we need to get an endorsement either from Parliament or the people.
So what would you expect somebody like Nigel Farage just to kind of go away?
No, I mean, look at the effect that he had. Taken on.
But again, to quote Phil Collins, the thwarting of the referendum will be the incarnate grievance on which his politics thrive. He has nothing else. It's all he needs. That is the case.
He's going to have
and he's shown that. He's proved that
exactly
in an election.
But I'm not suggesting we simply cancel Brexit. I'm suggesting we have another referendum. No, I'm suggesting we have another referendum, and then it's for the people to decide. So Nigel Farage...
So you'd be perfectly happy then. We have another election.
And we can go out...
The majority is exactly the same as the last time. Not massive, but still a proper majority. And you say, well, fine, that's it now.
I do.
Be happy.
If the
pack your bags and go away.
No, absolutely. What I've constantly said is, if the people, in the light of all that's happened, when it's a much more informed decision, they decide they still want to leave, that's an end of the matter. Right. And so Mr. Farage can go make his arguments in the referendum, except that this time, I think he'll find that he has a campaign against him that destroys the essential myth of the Brexit case, which is that Britain's not in control of its own laws, when actually Britain is in control of its own laws, and the decisions that matter to Britain's future are taken here.
But a quick thought, there is another way, and that is to have a general election.
Yes, there is another way, but what I argue in the article today is that it's wrong to mix Brexit up with other issues, because there's a substantial risk in a general election that people, even if they dislike Brexit, they vote for other reasons in order to maintain the government. And that would be wrong, in my view. You should treat Brexit on its own, as an issue on its own, as we did in the previous referendum. So I argue it's much better to have a referendum than an election.
What should we be doing in Iran or with Iran now?
Well, we should pursue a diplomatic solution, obviously. And we have one substantial card in our hands, which is that the Iranians have been trying to get the British and the Europeans to keep to the Iran nuclear deal. And therefore, actually, their attempt to interfere with a British flagged ship is obviously wrong, not just in principle, but it's obviously a political gamble for them. And so, look, this will be a negotiation that happens behind the scenes, and I hope it is one that can be resolved diplomatically. But we do have that card in our hand, and I'm sure the government will be playing it.
The trouble is we won't be negotiating with the Revolutionary Guard. They exercised enormous power in Iran. We know that. If they continue to do the sorts of things they've been doing, which is impeding, not just impeding, arresting a British a ship flying the British flag, then what do we do?
No, it's going to be difficult because the tensions are obviously significant, and we'll have to probably put into place arrangements that will allow us to guide our shipping through the Straits of Hormuz and elsewhere. So
do we have the wherewithal to do that?
We have the wherewithal to do it, and we can cooperate with other allies in doing it, but it will require us to, obviously now, to take special arrangements in order to protect British shipping. But I think, for the Iranians, yes, it's true, the IRGC are the key players in this, but they're also going to have to think as to whether they want to up the ante in circumstances where, on this issue at least, we would expect to have our allies unified behind us.
Hasn't the United States upped the ante?
The US has upped the ante in general terms, and obviously by withdrawing from the nuclear deal. But that is a matter between the US and Iran. I mean, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, that's one thing. But in respect of the British position has actually been to keep to the deal. Now, again, you can agree as to whether that's good or bad, but it should mean that the Iranians are cognizant of the fact that if they then start disrupting British shipping, same as if they start taking action against other players in Europe, then there is a risk for them, because the disagreement where the UK at the moment is saying keep to that nuclear deal and therefore keep to lifting the sanctions on Iran, that British position obviously will start to erode if the Iranians start interfering with our shipping.
What is the danger that we might tie ourselves too closely to the United States?
Well, look, I've always...
You bear the scars. I mean,
I absolutely do. So, but in my view, there are two relationships that Britain has upon which we found our strength and our influence and our ability to defend our values. One is the American relationship. The other is the European relationship. Get out of either of them and you're going to be weaker as a country.
And what do you think will happen?
I think we will find a diplomatic way through this particular crisis, but then I think there is a far bigger question for the future, which is how we're going to manage when we've taken away one pillar of our foreign policy, which is that European alliance. And I'm aware of the fact that, of course, we can cooperate with the Europeans on defence, on certain aspects of foreign policy. But this Iran deal is a very interesting example of where Britain was right at the centre of the European decision-making process, and now we're going to be out of it. And, I've always said to people, one of the reasons I'm against Brexit, look, I think short-term, Brexit is going to be difficult economically, but long-term, Britain will come back. I believe that. But politically, I think this is a game changer, for the future, that it's going to be very hard to work our way around.
Final thought, if you were Boris Johnson moving into number 10 tomorrow or on Wednesday, whenever he does, I was going to say, what's the first thing you do? What's the second thing you do? The first thing, presumably, would be to call a referendum. The second thing you do?
I think the second thing is to work out, if he does, he's got to think ahead. He's going to get advice as to whether it's possible to negotiate this thing he wants to negotiate with Europe or not. And let's assume he gets the advice he can't. Then he's got to think ahead as to how he sets out his stall for saying, look, I am against a referendum. I was against a referendum. I continue to be against a referendum. Nonetheless, there's no other way forward.
Right, I've acknowledged that that'll be your first thing, but what's the...
Right, and the second thing, I think, is to say, in those circumstances, and if you do end up redeciding this issue, and, it is obvious it is going to be a bitter and divisive thing, even though I think there's no alternative to it. I think then the question is, how do you create an agenda around which you can bring the country back together eventually? Because at some point, eventually, we have to do that.
Do you envy him?
Well, I think right now, our politics is in such a state that we kind of get numbed by it, and therefore I feel very politically motivated. So in one sense, I do envy him.
Ooh,
but
politically motivated, not coming back, are you?
No, don't. I don't want to alarm your listeners, but I'm speaking because I think anyone who looks at the state of the country's politics today, on both sides, frankly, is bound to be alarmed.
Tony Blair, thank you very much.
Thank you.
25